On the Strong Women podcast today, our guest is Melanie Kirkpatrick. She is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, which is a Washington think tank. She is a writer and a journalist, and we're going to talk about her books in a minute, but she's been a writer for the Wall Street Journal. She did that for 30 years and has co-edited several journal series. She spent 10 years in Asia and also lived in Canada because she got her master's degree in English from the University of Toronto and her bachelor's degree from Princeton University. And she is married to her husband, Jack David, who also is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And we invited Melanie on because we want to talk to her about actually a couple of her books. We're going to focus in on one because we are celebrating Thanksgiving this week. One of her books she wrote is called Thanksgiving, The Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience. And she also wrote a book called Escape from North Korea, The Untold Story of Asia's Underground Railroad. And her third book that we are going to talk to with her today is called Lady Editor, a biography about Sarah Josepha Hale and the making of the modern American woman. So Melanie, thank you so much for being on our podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be with you both.
So before we get into the heart of talking about this lady, Sarah Josepha Hale, we want to hear about your story, Melanie. Did you grow up in a Christian home?
I did. The church was a very big part of my life growing up. My parents, my grandparents, my sisters, outside of school, life really revolved around the church. And it had a big influence on me, of course. It set me, I think, on a good track, the right track. It instilled me with important values, and I am very grateful for it. So many people lack that, especially today, that I am very grateful that my parents were so devoted to making sure that my sisters and I were brought up in the church.
Okay, so you had sisters. How many sisters did you have?
2 younger sisters.
Okay, so you were the oldest girl. And then where did you grow up?
I grew up in Buffalo.
Okay.
And I went to a public school, K through 12, the same school. And my class was, I think, a third Protestant, a third Catholic, and a third Jewish. So and of course, my parents had friends of different faiths. And so I was exposed to other religions as well during my youth.
So when did you decide to go into journalism and writing? Was writing something you enjoyed doing even as a child, or was that more of something that happened in college for you?
Oh, kids try out many, many things. And I remember playing with my Ginny doll, and one day she'd be an ambassador, the next day she was a writer. And so you kind of act out fantasies and dreams and hopes with the dolls. But I was the editor of my high school newspaper, and I loved journalism there in high school. And when I went off to college, I kind of didn't get involved in extracurricular activities. I just buried myself in my scholarly activities, my academic activities. I thought I wanted to be a professor of English, but then I went to graduate school and discovered I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in the library. I wanted to be out and about in the world. So to make a long story short, a couple of years later came to journalism, and I am so glad I did.
It's fun to talk to journalists because the journalists that I've talked to and said, what got you hooked on journalism? They normally have this really compelling story that swept them off their feet. Not to put any pressure on you, but did you have a story that just captivated you, or an experience that made you go, this is the job for me?
No.
No. Okay. Prove my theory wrong.
I just knew that I wanted to work with words, and I loved journalism as a high schooler, and I was very fortunate to get my first job. And then I became, what's the word? Just immersed in it. The wonderful thing about journalism is that it's an excuse to learn about just about everything, and I love learning. So journalism was a great job for me. I also like taking ideas and synthesizing them in a way that I can communicate them to other people, and that's a lot of what you have to do as an editorial writer. Editorials at the Wall Street Journal, and I wrote hundreds of them, were, rarely went longer than 800 words, if that. And I found when I wrote Escape from North Korea, my first book, that it was really tough for me to learn to be long. I was so used to learning how to condense, that it was a bit of a challenge for me.
I want to talk about, I mean, you sound kind of like a similar woman to who you wrote about in Lady Editor, because she also loved words and was a writer. But I'm curious how you kind of stumbled upon her story, because as you write about in the book, this woman, Sarah Josepha Hale, is a woman that I didn't know about before your book, and I think probably most of our listeners, if not all, don't know who she is. But she was a household name in the 19th century in America, and you make the argument in the book, which I is totally true, that she's one of the most influential women in American history, and yet we don't know her. So how did you find out about her?
I found out about her as I was researching my second book on the history of our Thanksgiving holiday. And if people today know Sarah Hale, it's for one of two things. First, she wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. Believe it or not, it wasn't Mother Goose. Sarah Josepha Hale wrote it in 1830. And second, she is what's known as the Godmother of Thanksgiving. She was a very famous editor of the most popular magazine of the pre-Civil War period, and she used the pages of Godey's Ladies' Book, her magazine, to try to win support for a national shared day of Thanksgiving. At the time, late 18th, early 19th century, governors named Thanksgiving days, and with the result that Americans celebrated on many days between September and December. There was a wonderful saying that if you planned your travel itinerary carefully enough, you could have a Thanksgiving dinner every week between Election Day and Christmas. Uh, so, when I was researching the history of Thanksgiving, that's how I learned about her and her passion for the holiday. Eventually, as you probably know, President Lincoln in 1863 called the first in our modern series of Thanksgiving days, and that was in response to a letter that Hale wrote him.
She was a fireball. Erin and I were talking about this yesterday. I mean, we're going to talk more about her life, but Erin and I were saying, I wonder if she, would we like her, because she was just so passionate. I feel like reading about her trumpeting for Thanksgiving, I wonder if some of her friends were like, hey, Sarah, I mean, I like Thanksgiving and I get it too, but could we talk about something else? Because it seems like she just would get on a thing and that was the most important thing to her,
Well, she was indefatigable. She never wavered. She had a strong point of view, and she kept repeating it. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, the editor Bob Bartley, now deceased, used to say, I have to publish 65 editorials on a subject before anybody pays attention. And he just, 65 was a random number. But the point was that you have to keep hammering home if you want your readers to pay attention. And I think Hale had the same attitude. But most of her correspondence was destroyed, and one of the challenges was finding it all, what was left, and it's scattered all around the country in different libraries and different universities. But one wonderful letter I discovered was from a man who was a trustee of Vassar College. And in the 1860s, one of Hale's campaigns, and she had many of them, was to help Vassar College get off the ground. And so this man went to
And
this
that was a women's college,
a
right?
women's college, right?
Yeah.
It was presented as the first women's college that offered a rigorous curriculum of the standard of the Ivy League schools for young men. So this trustee went off to see Mrs. Hale in Philadelphia, and after which he wrote home to his wife saying, "You know, she's really a delightful, gracious person, not at all like her writing." And I, and that I elsewhere I read from other people about how amiable and how gracious she was. She welcomed people to visit her as she grew old. In 1876, which was the centennial of the Declaration of Independence, she was in Philadelphia. She issued an open invitation to the people from her hometown of Newport, New Hampshire, to, if they came to Philadelphia to celebrate the centennial, please call on me. And she was in her late 80s at that point.
So we would like her.
Yeah, you'd like her.
Just
And,
maybe like some of the things, be it, just calm down, Sarah, but let's talk about something
well,
else.
you'd like her. But
Yeah.
I also think that if we said something that she didn't agree with, she wouldn't hesitate to let us know what we should be thinking.
Yeah, I got that impression. But wait, before we get deeper into her life, I think it's pretty significant what the attitude towards women was during this time. Like, there wasn't. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Can you take us back, Melanie, to her beginning? Because, like what Sarah's saying, we need like a setup of what she grew up in. And I know her dad fought in the Revolutionary War. She was born around the time Washington was inaugurated as the first president. Is that right?
Yes, she was born in 1788, the year before Washington was inaugurated. Her father, in a farm in a village in New Hampshire. And her father was a veteran, as were many of her relatives. And she helped develop into a very patriotic person. Her mother was a very important figure in her life because her mother believed that girls should be as well educated as boys. And early on, Sarah, the kids were homeschooled back then, living on this remote farm, and the mother taught Sarah everything she taught her brother Horatio. But when Horatio went off to Dartmouth, Sarah couldn't go because Sarah, at that point, there wasn't a single institution of higher education that admitted women. So when fast forward now to 1828, when she became editor of the Ladies magazine in Boston, a predecessor of Godey's Ladies magazine, she announced in the first issue of the magazine that she was going to focus on education for women. And for the next 50 years, until she retired at the age of 89, every issue of her magazines talked about education for women in some form or another. In 1828, when she started, only about half of American women were literate. And as I mentioned earlier, no institute of higher education accepted women. When she died, there were many who did. There were co-ed schools that did, and there were women's colleges as well. So I think that her hammering home of these ideas among her readership helped change attitudes among Americans about the idea that women should be educated. And I'd also say one of her early campaigns, specifically about women in education, was she argued that women should be allowed to be teachers. Back then, there was a sense that women were not as intellectually capable as men, and that women did not have the intellect or the moral standing to be good teachers. Most of the teachers, except for small children, most of the teachers were men. And Hale campaigned for opening the profession to women. Of course, though, she said a woman can be as good a teacher as a man, but she has to be educated in the subject that she's teaching, and she has to be educated in how to teach.
Yeah, I loved reading about how she grew up, and of course the influence of her parents, and how this just laid that foundation for her to just assume and to know women are capable of much more than society thinks that they are. And I love the relationship with her brother and how he went off to college and would come home and bring his books and teach her what he had learned. So by the time he graduated from Dartmouth, she had the same education. She really had a Dartmouth education.
Yeah. It was
as
like she
well.
I like to think she was the first woman to get a degree from Dartmouth. So 175 years before a woman actually did. I should say something about her religious life, because it was such an essential part of who she was. Her family, or at least her mother, I'm not sure about her father, were Congregationalists, and that is the religion that grew out of the Puritan belief. And she grew up she grew up reading the Bible. One of her favorite books was Pilgrim's Progress. And when she moved to Boston, I'm not sure what church, I couldn't find out what church she attended, but when she went to Philadelphia, she moved to Philadelphia at some point because Godey's Ladies Book was headquartered there. When she moved to Philadelphia, she became an Episcopalian, probably because there weren't congregational churches there, and she needed to find a church home. In any case, her religious beliefs impacted every aspect of her life. Late in life, there's a wonderful excerpt in a letter that she wrote to a friend, and I may have the numbers here wrong, but it goes something like this. She said, "I have 13 grandchildren. 4 are with Jesus, and the rest are still here in their earthly lives."
I love too the way you unfold the story of Sarah, and she got married and started having children. And
Didn't you love her husband, Sarah?
Oh yeah,
that when she got married, I loved to read that part about how her husband was also just so encouraged her writing and stuff.
Right.
Anyway,
and they would
going,
read. They would read together at night. I just love that. Like they were challenging each other intellectually, and but he died early. You want to talk about that?
He died of pneumonia, very suddenly, leaving her with 4 children, 7 and under, and a 5th on the way. So his death had a profound impact, obviously. The family did pretty well. They had a nice house, and David Hale was a lawyer and bringing in a good income. But they had, like a lot of young people getting started in life, they hadn't saved a lot. So when he died, she was left virtually penniless. And she was determined that she was going to find a way to educate their 5 children in the way that her husband and she had wished.
Well, and another part of that is that there weren't that many occupations open for women during that time. I mean, other than, because you already mentioned even being a teacher wasn't really open to women, which we think now a lot of, probably, I don't know what the statistics are now, but so many women are teachers now, thanks to Sarah.
I can tell you, it's, I looked it up the other day. It's for K to 12, about 76% of teachers are women.
Yeah. So she's now widowed. They don't have a savings, and she wants to have this wonderful education for her children. But and she had been writing already with the encouragement of her husband. But now, the writing was not really a paid occupation at that
No,
point for
no,
women
not at
either.
all.
So tell us how that unfolded for her.
Her husband had been a Freemason, and the Freemasons of Newport set her up in a millinery shop. Millinery means making hats. She hated it, but needlework at the time was really the only respectable occupation opened to women. But it was drudgery and didn't bring in very much income. So, in addition to her millinery shop, she started writing. Um, she started out with poems, and she got herself published in Boston and began to make a name for herself. She always published in that period of her life. She published under a pseudonym because it was, the idea that a woman was working and making income. It didn't go over very well.
Like Joe March, because that would have been in about the
Yes,
same
yes.
time period, right? Yeah.
It actually would have been about 30 years earlier.
Okay, okay.
But same idea. Her favorite pseudonym was Cornelia. And then the Masons agreed to publish a book of poetry for her. And she used the byline, A Woman of New Hampshire. That was the name. So, and then she wrote a novel. Here, she's still at home now, still widowed, still doing her millinery thing. And this time she put her name on it, and which I think was a rather daring gesture. So the novel caught the attention of a man in Boston who was about to start a serious intellectual journal aimed at women. And he wrote her out of the blue, asking her if she would become the editor.
Yeah, and that was when she made the move to Boston. And that part about, because to move there, she had to leave some of her children behind with family. And as a mother of 5 kids myself, I just thought, oh, that would have been so difficult for her to do. But she knew it was an opportunity to make money and provide for her family. And so she had to make a tough call. And she did take her youngest one.
Yeah, it was a wrenching experience for her. And on top of that, she was criticized by many of the people of the town of Newport, and that was very hurtful. But I'll say that she maintained, she educated every one of her children very well, and she maintained a very close relationship with them. There's a poignant letter from her oldest son, who went to West Point, who wrote and became a soldier, who wrote her saying that we will never forget all that you've done to make our lives possible for us.
So wonderful. Okay, so she gets this invitation for this women's magazine, and I thought it was so funny in your book when you were talking about, she wanted this to be different in as far as what was considered literature for women at that time. And she said she exonerated most public prose aimed at female readers as trashy and vapid.
Right.
So she just wanted this women's magazine. So we hear women's magazine today and we think of, trashy and vapid things like
Yeah.
Cosmopolitan or things, Vogue or something like that. But this women's magazine for our modern ears is not what we think of as a women's magazine. So maybe you can tell us a little
Sure.
bit about
Yeah, and
this.
I agree and disagree with you, Erin, and I'll come to that.
Okay.
But the ladies' magazine was, she wrote most of it, because but I'll back up. I mentioned that growing up in Newport, New Hampshire, with so many veterans in the family, she became very patriotic. And she had this idea that while America had been unified politically by the Revolutionary War, it was not unified culturally. And what she set out to do in her magazines was to publish American authors writing about American topics. And you think this would be obvious, and today it is kind of obvious, but back then it was a new way of putting together a magazine. And so she had a very good literary eye, and she began to write about and review the books of many men and women whom she thought, Americans, whom she thought were worthy of attention. People like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. She also published the young Harriet Beecher Stowe 30 years before she became famous with Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that was an important aspect of both of her magazines. The point where I would disagree with you, Erin, is that in the late 30s, when she had become editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, Godey's was a different magazine. Mr. Godey wanted Hale to be editor because he wanted to make it more intellectual, and so she went there and brought the serious stuff to the magazine. But she also thought that her readers, who were middle class women, would want to read about domestic things as well. And she was the first one to introduce a recipes section to a magazine or a publication, which I think is astonishing. But again, this fit in with her wish to unify Americans and create an American aesthetic, whether that be literature or food or fashion or arts.
Well, okay, there's a couple things that come to mind as you're talking about this. First of all, her recipes are not always easy, because I was reading the one that she had about the christening cake, and I'm like, yeah. I can't even do that with all the tools that I have now, like the KitchenAid. I mean, it was like beating for 10 minutes the egg whites, and then you add a couple things and beat 30 more minutes. I'm yes. like, my word. There's two things I think she really brought to the table. One, and we'll get more into this later, but just the holistic view of women, and a deeper understanding of really what it means to be created in the image of God, right? Because of the way she viewed women holistically, and that their vocations were she elevated the vocation of housekeeper and things like that. But I want to get into that in just a minute. But the other thing that you kind of alluded to with pulling out these American stories, because every culture has their shared memories. And, from England, you've got King Arthur, and you've got the kind of like a myth around King Arthur. And then you've got, the ancient civilizations had their myths that they kind of built their community life together around. And it almost seems like she was creating a shared culture for America that was so new that they didn't quite have that yet. And so that I was really impressed by that. But okay, now back to the magazine, and she had these 3 categories that you mentioned. She had the intellectual, the entertainment, which was like poetry. It wasn't like, Brad Pitt married this girl, but and then the practical advice. So do you want to talk about, because that was a pretty unique structure, right?
Yeah, and in a way, it's the same formula that applies to magazines today, or for magazines for women today.
Would you say that the average women's magazine offers intellectual?
Yeah, I
things?
do.
Okay.
They will write about books.
Mm-hmm.
It depends. They'll do interviews with serious people. Um, uh, they'll certainly offer opinions on political issues. Unfortunately, sometimes, but definitely not as intellectual as in Hale's day. So much of this goes back to education, and a lot of what she published was aimed at encouraging women to educate themselves and to pursue education whenever possible, certainly for their children. In the area of the kind of the practical advice, she she thought that housekeeping and the role of women in the home overall should be professionalized. And there was one line which I can't quote directly, but she said, just as the farmer who grows the wheat needs to be educated how best to do so, the woman who makes the bread needs to be educated too, which I thought was interesting. She created the term domestic science as a way to elevate the work that women do in the home. And she kept, pressing for, technology that would help women do their work better in the home. At the same time, she was encouraging the opening of professions and other jobs to women. She was an ardent supporter of women becoming doctors. And this was she had an interesting twist on it, though. She wanted women to be, to treat other women, and she wanted women to treat children. And she wanted only women to treat women and children. She thought that men can treat men, but let women take care of women and children, which was a different way of looking at it. But back to her magazines, they were a fascinating mix of things. There was always a short story, and there were lots of poems. As you mentioned, Sarah, it was a popular entertainment of the day. There were articles about schools for women, high schools and what we would call high schools and colleges. Even though Mr. Godey supposedly had a no politics rule for his magazine, she wrote about politics all the time when it came to women's issues. She editorialized in support of laws that would ban the practice of coverture, which was the common law doctrine that said that a married woman had to turn all of her financial affairs over to her husband. And this was, there were laws about coverture that lasted till the end of the century, but end of the 19th century. But in her lifetime, she was able to help push for the eradication of those laws in New York State and elsewhere. So that was one example of her involving herself in politics. She also editorialized for public funding of education for women. She thought it was outrageous that men's colleges could get public funds. Little money, public money, was spent on women. She editorialized for high schools, public high schools for women. And she also was very interested in vocational training, especially for less fortunate women, more in the working class. And she wanted to teach them skills that would allow them to care for themselves and their families if their husband died or wasn't able to care for them.
Well, that's where I think the magazine and maybe we'll just agree to disagree, but I think her magazine is like head and shoulders above what's offered to women in this culture, especially young women. Just like hearing about the magazine and that she would include poetry and and art and short stories, of course, that she had written. And she's so gifted in writing. And then exposing her readers to Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne before people knew who she just had an eye
I
for.
guess you've persuaded me. I should take a look at I should take another look at magazines for young women today.
Well, yeah, I just was blown away by what she did through, because again, to modern ears, I hear magazine and I think one thing. And then as I'm reading your book and going, oh my gosh, this was like not, I mean, magazine is almost like, I don't even want to, I want to give it a more
Well,
dignified word, because it was more like a journal is what I would think of. But it became so popular, I think, because what she was offering to women was this deeper thought life and beauty. And she was, calling them to deeper, better ways of thinking and living, and pushing against, this, like Sarah said, I mean, really, she's pushing for women are image bearers of God too.
which
And
is something that she wrote frequently.
yeah,
She believed that
yeah.
fervently. Let me say a word about fashion. Um, yeah, fashion was certainly very important to Godey's Ladies book, as it is to magazines today. But Sarah Hale hated it, and she thought it was a waste of money and a waste of time, and she wanted to Americanize fashion, and uh, and she thought American women should stop taking their cue from London and Paris and instead create their own way of dress, which she would say would be comfortable um, and simple, not elaborate. And yet, you know, but it's interesting that Godey uh, uh, let her speak about fashion in a magazine that was known for its hand-colored fashion plates, and I think that says something about the value Godey placed on Hale's service. And he also understood that the content she provided was an essential reason that his magazine was so popular.
She didn't think men should wear mustaches
Right,
because
right.
that's masking something nefarious if you're trying
Yeah,
to
so
mask your face with a mustache.
right, she called them whiskeroos. So,
That didn't catch on though.
no, that was one of her campaigns that I don't think went anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, now I have to. This is one question I wanted to ask you, Melanie, because as I'm reading the book and how she wrote about fashion, and I was cracking up, and yet, and also like I loved how she wanted to create American culture, like Sarah was talking about, and a country needs a shared culture, and Sarah Hale understood that. But what's funny to me, and this is what I want to ask you, she loved Queen Victoria. And Sarah Hale is the reason we wear white wedding
Yes,
dresses,
yes.
because she loved Queen Victoria and put this beautiful picture of, wasn't it, of her in her wedding dress in the magazine?
I know she published lots of drawings of fashionable women in white, but I don't remember a picture of Victoria. She did describe Victoria's wedding dress in very close detail. And I think she saw Victoria as a moral exemplar. Here was the most powerful woman in the world who held this important position and yet was a devoted family woman, devoted to her husband, Prince Albert, and devoted to their many children. So, I think that was a key part of it. She also, besides the white wedding dress, she turned to Victoria for introducing the Christmas tree to America.
Yeah,
And
that was so fascinating.
and
Tell us about
she
that. Yeah.
did publish a painting, an engraving, pardon me, that had run in a London newspaper showing Victoria and Albert and their children around a Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. And so Hale photoshopped this photo, we would say today, this engraving, we would say today. She removed the hated mustache of Prince Albert, and she got rid of Victoria's tiara. And so it ended up just looking like the scene of that could have taken place in a middle class home in America, and this set off a craze for the Christmas tree. And 10 years later, they were like the white wedding gown, very popular around the country.
Yeah, and you have that picture in your book, and it's
Yes.
just it's so beautiful. And I just thought, yeah, funny that she still had an affection for England, at least because of Queen Victoria. But her influence in all these things, the white wedding dress, the Christmas tree, and you mentioned Mary Had a Little Lamb. So maybe you can use that story to talk about how did we forget about her? Because she was so influential, and then everybody listening knows the poem Mary Had a Little Lamb, at least the first stanza. And she wrote that, but like you said, we all thought Mother Goose wrote that, Mother Goose being no one. This anonymous, this poem just fell out of the air, and we all know it. So, but that led to, even like you mentioned, at the end of her life, I think 4 days before she died, she was writing into someone saying, "No, I wrote that poem, even though I didn't get credit." So,
Well, it's interesting to speculate whether if she had been given credit, early on, uh, whether she'd be better known today. I kind of think not. I think what happened was, first of all, people looking at her work through modern eyes note immediately that she was against suffrage for women. And that contaminates her immediately in the eyes of modern feminists. But from Hale's point of view, and this point of view was shared by a majority of American women in the middle of the 19th century, she thought politics was a dirty business and women should rise above it. She saw women as being of a higher moral plane than men, and said that they should advise the men in their family about politics. And instead of having to deal with the rough and tumble of politics, the women should think about what the moral value of an issue should be. Another reason was that after her retirement and death in the 1870s, the magazine Godey's magazine really went downhill quickly, and I think if she was incorrectly associated with that, that would also taint her reputation. And a third reason is perhaps that she did so much that it's hard to pinpoint. I also think that, from my point of view, she was a foundational figure in in the move toward women's equity with men. And it's hard to imagine the suffragettes getting as far as they did, as quickly as they did, if they hadn't been educated, and if their supporters had not been educated. So she first started writing about education for women 20 years before the convention at Seneca Falls in 1848. So I do believe she was a very important foundational figure. And I'll note that at the end of her life, she did come to support the election of women to school boards. And history has shown that that success helped pave the way toward larger suffrage.
Well, let's spend some time talking about her campaign for Thanksgiving. So what was she advocating? Because I mean, I'm imagining it's beyond just having a turkey and watching football. But why did she care so much about this shared day for a national holiday?
I think there were a couple of reasons. One, she loved the holiday, and she wanted every American to be able to partake in it. Some states didn't always have a holiday. Most did. Most did. But she saw it as a way to unify the country. It goes back to her idea of creating a shared cultural identity as well as a shared political identity. And she started her campaign in the 1840s. And as the country moved closer to civil war, she argued that if we all celebrated Thanksgiving on the same day, it would help to prevent the war. She saw it as a way of keeping the country together so that they wouldn't fight. I think she also saw it as falling into the woman's sphere. The idea it's a holiday about family and about food and about faith, and that's usually in a home the domain of a woman. So I think that was part of it. And finally, I think she saw it as an example of American generosity and of caring for those who are less fortunate than we are. So it all, and to get her idea across, she published many articles in Godey's Lady's book, but she also privately sent sent letters to what we would call influencers today. The governors of every state, she would write them every year. Can you imagine handwriting all those letters? And she wrote to Americans abroad, and she wrote to presidents of the United States. And one of the interesting things about that indicates how influential she was, that the presidents responded. And they, until Lincoln, they all said, no, we're not going to do it. That's a right that belongs to the state, not to the governors, not to the president. But I think it's fascinating that they actually took the trouble to respond to her.
Yeah, yeah. One of my favorite stories of the whole book, and I really want a painting that depicts this image, is when a friend brought her a book and she was sweeping her entryway. And then hours later, another friend comes to visit and finds her leaning on her broomstick reading a book. And I just imagine that she was the sort of lady who took keeping a house very seriously, but she also realized the same mess will be there tomorrow, but I may not have the opportunity to read tomorrow. So I think I'll just lean on my broomstick and read a chapter or two. But anyway, I wanted to hear from you. I mean, you really got to know Sarah throughout your writing, I'm sure. What was there anything that she mentored you in? You know what I mean? Like, did you learn something from her life that you're like, I'm going to take that and really take it to heart?
Oh, there's so many things I think all of us can learn from her life. One is persistence. One is, rising above adversity. And I also appreciated very much her, and this is where we began, her gracious spirit. She was always a lady. And I think in our coarse culture today, that's an important thing for women to remember.
Yeah. Well, that leads well to a question we always like to ask our guests. But Melanie, we have listeners, all ages actually, that span lots of different stages of life. But we have listeners in junior high, high school, college, young women who listen to this podcast. So could you give the young women listening some advice, maybe advice you wish you knew when you were that age, or just knowing the culture today, advice that you would give young women?
I guess I would say find your own way with the help of God, if you are a believer. And, you know, you don't always have to do what everybody else does. So find your own way and be resolute. Stick with it.
Well, we know that you enjoy reading, just as Sarah Hale enjoyed reading. But are you reading? What are you reading right now?
Oh, I am reading a fascinating novel, a new novel called Everlasting Song by Ha Jin, a Chinese writer. And it's fascinating because, of course, I lived in Asia, but it's about a Chinese musician who is well known in his country, though not a huge celebrity, who to make a long story short, he comes to America, and the Chinese government does everything it can to make him go back to China. And it's a terrifying story about the power that the central government in China chooses to exert over a single, rather humble citizen, because it fears that this man is going to make China look bad. And we all have read about the surveillance society in China, and this is a chilling example of it. I'm only halfway through the book, so I don't know what happens,
That
but
sounds so fascinating. I want to read that.
I am enjoying it.
Okay, last question that we love to ask our guests is, what woman in history would you have coffee with? I wish Sarah Hale were here with us, that we could just ask her a million questions. She is now added to my list of women that I want in history that I want to have coffee with. But
Of course, I have to answer. I want to have coffee or tea. I'm a tea drinker with Sarah Josepha Hale. There's so many things I'd like to ask her, and one is about this, the modern concept of having it all. This never appears in her work. While she is supportive and encouraging of women moving into professions and other jobs, and she wants women to have financial independence, and she wants women to be educated. I think if you asked her what the most important thing she had done in her life, I think her answer would have been, I'm a mother. And she had placed such a high value on women's role in raising children and setting them on the right path.
And her life is really an example of she did have to choose in a lot of ways. She couldn't have it all at the same time. She had to say, I have to provide for my family. And so I'm going to lean heavily on other family to help me with my kids. That would be so challenging.
I love that answer, Melanie. And I just thought I'd end this episode, since it's our Thanksgiving episode, with reading something from your Thanksgiving book, which we also hope our listeners will get. This is a wonderful book to read just to appreciate our American tradition of Thanksgiving. Melanie gives us the history and so many good reasons why this should be a continued tradition in our country. But in your book, you include Psalm 100 from the Ainsworth Psalmster of 1612, and that this was certainly a psalm that the Pilgrims would have spoken at that first Thanksgiving. So I thought I would read that just for our listeners as we are about to celebrate Thanksgiving. It says, "Shout ye triumphantly to Jehovah all the earth. Serve ye Jehovah with gladness. Come before him with singing joy. Know ye that Jehovah is God. Enter ye his gates with confession, his courts with praise. Confess ye to him, bless his name. For Jehovah is good, his mercy is forever, and his faith unto generation and generation. Happy Thanksgiving, Melanie. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Sarah and Aaron, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your families.